dangerous men. I try not to romanticize them. These are entertaining stories. But at the same time, I interviewed the family members of Ed Bremer, who was kidnapped and held captive. He was terrified that he was going to die, and his whole family was terrified. So I tried in my book to bring to life not only the crooks, but also their victims, so we can remember the good people of St. Paul who tolerated the crooks in their midst for so long paid a terrible penalty for believing that they could coexist with gangsters.
Now, what was the relationship with people like Dillinger and Al Capone? Because wasn't Capone the biggest kingpin in America?
He was, and it's a question I've never been able to answer. Al Capone, working out of Cicero, Illinois, which was a suburb just nearby Chicago, obviously owned Chicago and owned Cicero. Capone was very involved in Wisconsin. Even though there were organized crime figures like the Balistraries, Frank Capone, Al Capone's brother, ran a restaurant in Wisconsin. Whenever Capone, it got too hot for Capone in Chicago, he'd go to Wisconsin for steak and relaxation and to do target shooting of deer using Thompson submachine guns. But for some reason, Capone never moved in on St. Paul. My guess is it's because Kid Can had ties to Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, some of the most powerful mafia figures. My guess is that Kid Can owned Minnesota and that Capone was not strong enough to break through into Minnesota. But Capone stayed at the Commodore, which everybody knows as a beautiful condominium with a lovely bar, the Commodore Hotel, right near W.A. Frost. Third floor was Al Capone's suite. And then right to his left was the place where Ma Barker lived. So again, the good people of St. Paul knew that all these people were here. I talked to people who were young men who would knock on Ma Barker's door to sell fundraising tickets. And Ma Barker would open the door, and Ma Barker, you know, her face was on the cover of every magazine in America. So it's like, oh, hi, Ma Barker. And she'd give them jelly donuts, because she was a sweetie, and then they'd look over her shoulder, and there's all the submachine guns. So the amazing thing to me is the people of St. Paul knew that they were living among snakes, and they tolerated it because they figured they were safe, and it was a lively city because of it.
Absolutely. Now, the major bridges from Minneapolis, like the Lake Street and the Forde Bridge, did Minneapolis cops just sit at that bridge and just wait to catch guys coming out? Or that also seems like a bottleneck. What was the relationship between the Twin Cities at that time?
What a fascinating question. St. Paul was more an outlaw city. They had the O'Connor system, which was the infrastructure for crime in St. Paul. But really, the Barker boys, the others, they were outlaws, kind of like Jesse James. Minneapolis was more organized. You know, you might say St. Paul was disorganized crime. Minneapolis was organized. As Tony Boza, who used to be the chief of Minneapolis police, told me, when bodies are floating down the Mississippi, you're not making money. So Kid Can made sure that not a lot of people died in Minneapolis. His goal was maximize profit for organized crime. These guys here, the Barker boys, all of them died in hails of lead. So that was the difference. And for that reason, organized crime or disorganized crime in St. Paul died in about 1936. Organized crime lived on in Minneapolis till about Kid Can's death, which was in 1981. So organized crime was more sustainable than the outlaws.
In what sense was it organized? I mean, was it classic mafioso extortion, rackets, that kind of thing?
Political influence.
Yeah.
If you wanted to open a bar or a restaurant on the Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, you had to know Kid Can, and you had to pay tribute either to Kid Can or his guys. That's the way Minneapolis worked. And there's a great story about Mayor Hubert Humphrey, who truly, I think, wanted to clean up the town. I think it was too big a job for Humphrey to do. But apparently, the brother of one of the gangsters, Chicky Berman, again, a great gangster nickname, Chicky. Chicky Berman met with the new mayor, Hubert Humphrey, and Chicky goes, "How much do we have to pay you for you to do what we want, Mayor?" And Humphrey goes, "Well, let me think about it. How about $1 million?" And Chicky goes, $1 million, Mayor, that will bankrupt us. And apparently Hubert Humphrey said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Which sounds a little bit like an apocryphal story, but I love telling it anyway.
Yeah. So we got about 3 minutes left. How did it all wind down? I mean, especially in
Great
St. Paul, there was the end of Prohibition, and then they transitioned into
Kidnapping,
Yeah.
bankrupt. To be honest with you, the gangster era of St. Paul would have gone on probably for another decade or two, except 10 wealthy men in St. Paul had had enough. It's about 1934 and 1935. They realized the whole St. Paul police force is corrupt to the core. That's why the gangsters are able to kidnap their friends, like William Hamm and Ed Bremer. So they bring up a collection. They all donate apparently a couple $1,000s, put together a pool. They hire an investigative reporter and detective. He wiretaps the phones of the St. Paul Police Headquarters, which still stands today. They were aluminum pamograph discs. They didn't have digital, they didn't have magnetic tape at the time. And the detective was able to capture the chief and others of the St. Paul Police talking to the crooks, turned it over to a newspaper, the St. Paul Daily News. The St. Paul Daily News put on its headlines, "Crooked St. Paul Cops." They printed the conversations between the cops and the crooks. The shame that the people of St. Paul felt nationwide. St. Paul became the laughing stock of America. That was the impetus for firing or removing, unfortunately none of them went to jail, the crooked cops. And that was really the end of gangsterdom in St. Paul in those days.
Now, you said it went on for a while after that there were some last vestiges. I don't remember what you said. I know Minneapolis went till 1980, you said.
Minneapolis went to the 1980s. And you know, what's so sad is you can learn a lot about organized crime by looking at organized crime in the past. But the fact is, the drugs that go through Minneapolis St. Paul Airport today exceed in profit anything that the bootleggers brought in the 1930s. The heroin, the cocaine that comes in. We still have organized crime.
Yeah.
The complexion of organized crime has changed. Back in those days, it was Jewish, like me, Italian, and Irish. There were Irish, Italian, and Jewish mobs in town. Now, the Italian, the Irish, and the Jewish have become the judges, the lawyers, the corporate chieftains of the Twin Cities. And the new gangs are very often Asian American and others who have ties to Colombia and other areas. So the sad thing is, the same drives that brought us gangsterdom in the 30s are still active today. The drug has changed, the amount of money that changes hands has changed, but it's still here.
And it's not really the same. The O'Connor system is now gone, but something invisible has replaced it?
It has to be, because you look at what happened in the 1930s. You had the mayor on the take, the police on the take, a U.S. senator who talked to Leon Gleckman on a phone call on the take. Well, in order to have cocaine and heroin flowing into the Twin Cities, as they definitely are, you can't do that without the overworld. What we learned from the 30s is the underworld and the overworld cooperate, and that's still what's happening today, but less visibly.
And we got to wrap it up at that, but it's now they call it campaign finance. It's the same kind of thing going on.
It's true.
We've been talking with Paul Maccabee about his breakthrough book, John Dillinger Slept Here, a fabulous look at the history of the gangster area in St. Paul. Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's been my
John.
pleasure.
Thanks
We'll
so much.
see you next week on the St. Paul Forum.